Hi, and welcome to Chapter 3, Learning Objective 2, Part 2. Okay, so in the first objective, what we did was we looked at how to calculate the opportunity cost again. And again, that's really important that you know how to do that for this coming up lecture, because now we're going to do something with all of those numbers that we had produced in the previous lecture. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you. Okay, and let's do this. Slideshow. Okay. So here we're going to continue to talk and calculate an absolute and comparative advantage. So we want to determine who has an absolute advantage and who has a comparative advantage. And then we're going to take a look at why a producer cannot have a comparative advantage in production of all goods if they have an absolute advantage in the production of any good. Okay, so let's first talk about an absolute advantage. And as I had said in our previous lecture, an absolute advantage is who absolutely could produce more given the amount of inputs. Whoops, let me erase that. So who absolutely can produce more. Okay, in our example, what we did was we looked at originally the US. So here's, I'll just roughly draw it here. We had 5,000 tons of wheat that they could possibly produce, and we had 500 computers that they could possibly produce. And looking at this, we want to compare it then, or we want to take a look at who absolutely can produce more. Here's Japan. Japan could produce 1,200 tons of wheat, or let's see, 240 computers. So the first thing we do is look at the axes and we say, okay, who can produce more? Who can produce more wheat? So let's start with there. So looking at the wheat axis, the US can produce 5,000, Japan can only produce 1,200. So we can say that the US has an absolute advantage in wheat because 500 is greater than 1,200. Then we look at the computer axis and we say, okay, who absolutely can produce more? The US can produce 500, Japan can only produce 240. So the US also has an absolute advantage in computers. Now, what I do to trip you up, and I'm going to tell you right now, is I will ask you the question now, should the US trade? Should the US trade with Japan? And at this point, the right answer is I don't know, okay? Because we don't know. An absolute has nothing to do with trade. So that's really what I want you to take away from this. It just means they can produce more given the amount of inputs that they have. Okay, so on the test, I will ask you about this several times to make sure you understand the difference between an absolute advantage and a comparative advantage. Absolute, who absolutely can produce more given the amount of inputs. And as we just looked at, the US can produce more wheat and computers. So the US has an absolute advantage in wheat. And if a country has an absolute advantage in one good and specializes in that good, then both countries can gain from trade. So we're going to see that a little bit more on, but I just want you to really understand that absolute has nothing to do with trade for our purposes. Okay. All right. So now what we're going to do is to look at each country's opportunity cost and then to determine who has a comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is the one that determines trade. And essentially what we're going to do is to compare the opportunity cost, I'll just put OC for opportunity cost, of each good in each country. Okay. All right. So to answer and to compare to compare opportunity costs, we're going to use a thing called a trade table. It's called different things, but that's just kind of what I do. So the trade table answers, should these two countries trade? Who should produce what? This will also be the country's comparative advantage. What's a fair price in terms of one good in terms of the other? So think of a barter in this respect. So if one country trades computers for wheat, how much is one computer worth, okay, in the trade? Okay. And then who should export and import which goods? So the trade table allows us to answer all four of these questions. Okay, so let's go ahead and draw a trade table. Now, as long as you always draw this correctly, you will always be correct. I'm not going to use this cell right here, but what we want to do up here on our, I'm going to use columns and rows kind of example. So on our column headings, up here we want to put our people or our countries. As long as you set it up right, you're always going to get the right answer. So we're dealing with the US and we're dealing with Japan. Along the rows, the row headings, that's where I want my goods or services. And in our problem, we're dealing with computers and wheat. Okay, so up top on the column headings are our people or our countries. Our row headings are always our goods and our services. Okay, so I want to clean this up because I want to do some other stuff with it. So let me just erase a few things here. Just going to erase that now that you know where things go. Okay, essentially we're going to use this table to capture the information about opportunity cost. So remember in our example, we said in the US, the opportunity cost of one computer was 10 wheat, and the opportunity cost of one wheat is 1/10 of a computer. For Japan, maybe I should draw Japan in a different color here just to keep them separate. In Japan, the opportunity cost of one computer is 5 wheat, and the opportunity cost of one wheat is 1/5 of a computer. Now what I want to do is bring this information into the trade table. So how do I do that? Well, what I ask is every time I produce whatever this product is I'm talking about, I'm just going to start with computers. What do I give up? Okay, so every time I produce one computer in the US, that's how I'm going to look at this. So the US, every time I produce one computer in the US, what do I give up? Or what is the opportunity cost of one computer in the US? So to fill out this cell, I'm going to just go and I'm going to collect this information. And every time I produce one computer in the US, I give up 10 wheat. So I'm going to go ahead and put a 10 there. And I'll just put a really small W because my focus is on that 10. Okay. Now, again, if I want to ask this a little bit differently, and whichever way you ask it, as long as it makes sense to you, that's perfect. You can also ask, and I'll do that one with Japan, every time, what's the opportunity cost of one wheat and I'm going to ask 1 wheat in the US. So every time I produce 1 wheat in the US, what do I give up? And I'm just going to use that information and put it right here. And that is 1/10 of a computer. Okay. Now, just again, going to clean this up just a bit. And now I want to move my focus over to Japan. Okay. So now, every time I produce 1 computer in Japan, what do I give up? Every time I produce 1 computer in Japan, I give up 5 wheat. So I'm going to put a 5 right there. And then every time I produce 1 wheat in Japan, how many computers do I give up? I give up 1/5 of a computer. Now, your double check here should be this. Is row 1 a reciprocal of 2? Notice it is 10, 1/10, 5, 1/5. Okay, so let's see if I can do this. Okay, so notice 10 is a reciprocal of 1/10, 5 is a reciprocal of 1/5. And we have captured all of our information here in the table. Now we want to use the table to actually look at which number is, who has a comparative advantage and what. So this is what I want you to do, is I want you just to look at row 1. Okay, so I'm just looking here at row 1. Forget row 2 exists. Just don't even look at that. So I'm looking at my computer row, and I'm going across the row, and I'm going to ask myself, in this row, which number is lower? Okay, well, we have a 10 and we have a 5. Because 5 is lower than 10, I'm going to go ahead and circle the 5, and I'm going to draw an arrow up to Japan and over to computers. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the next row, and I'm going to ask which number is lowest. Okay, now here, if you want to change them to decimals, you can. And I know that when we look at decimals, I know 1/10 is 0.10 and 1/5 is 0.20. So sometimes it can make it a little easier to look at. So now going to row 2 specifically, I can say, okay, which number is lower, a 10th or a 20th? And then what I can do is I'm going to circle the lower number. And I'm going to draw an arrow up to the US and over to the wheat. Okay? Now, what have we just done? Essentially, what we've done is to determine, the comparative advantage. So the comparative advantage, if I follow Japan's roadmap, if you will, if I follow Japan down to, let's see, there we go. If I follow Japan's roadmap here, right? Japan is going to produce computers because Japan has a comparative advantage in computers. Okay, I can do computers and up to Japan if I want to know who's going to produce what. So I can say now that Japan has a comparative advantage in computers. Okay, now going to my next row, again, I can look at who has a comparative advantage in wheat. Now, it won't always work out that there is a comparative advantage. So you do have to go through this process. But who has a comparative advantage in wheat? I can just follow the roadmap, and I can say the US has a comparative advantage in wheat, or who has a comparative advantage in wheat? The US. So I can do that both ways. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and say the U.S. has a comparative advantage in wheat. Okay, now as long as each circle is diagonal to each other, so here they are diagonal, they could be this way as well, but as long as the circles are diagonal, these two countries should trade. Now that's a really poor test answer, and the test answer would look a little bit more like this. These two countries should trade as long as each has a comparative advantage in the opposite good, and they do in this instance. So the first thing that the trade table allows us to answer is, should these two countries trade? And you're going to say, oops, yes, trade, and you're going to say yes. And you're not going to say because the circles are diagonal, but that's your double check. You're going to say because each has a comparative advantage in the opposite good. So this is the reasoning why the two should trade. Okay. So we captured the information that we calculated. Now go ahead and take a minute and see if you can fill out the trade table here. Okay. And go ahead and hit pause if you'd like. Again, I'm just going to go ahead and put the US here, Japan, and I'm going to go ahead and put computers and wheat. A lot of students ask me, does it matter which you put first? No, it does not. Remember, the US, every time you produce one computer, you give up 10 wheat. I'm going to do that a different color just to keep everything cool. So 10 wheat. Every time you produce one wheat, you give up a tenth of a computer. And in terms of Japan, every time you produce one computer, you give up 5 wheat, and that is a fifth of a computer. And then go, which number's lowest? Row by row. That's where you get your roadmap from. Okay, so 5 up to Japan, over to computers, a tenth. There we go. Okay, and now we can see the roadmap of opportunity costs. So we use this to compare the opportunity costs. And remember, there's a few things about the table I just want to remind you of. So again, US, Japan, make sure those are your rows, and computers and wheat. Every time we produce one computer in the US, we give up 10 wheat. 1/10 of a computer, 5 wheat, 1/5 of a computer. And then we went ahead and asked which one was lowest. And I know I'm going through this several times, but this tends to be difficult for students, okay? And remember, it's which is lower in each row. Okay, and a tenth here. Okay, now there's a few things about the trade table. Always use the trade table, excuse me, starting with the outside. Now, that's why I didn't want the focus to be on the wheat and the computer. What do I mean by that? See these little W's and C's? Some people like to start on the inside and work their way outward. If you do that, you'll end up with the wrong answer. So remember, always work the trade table from the outside to the inside. So we're going to start out here either with our countries, or we're going to start off with our products, right? So as I read the trade table, I went computers, Japan, okay? Starting at the outside rows, wheat, US, or I could start up here and say US, follow it down to wheat. Okay. Should these two countries trade? We've already said yes, they should absolutely trade. Okay. They should trade as long as the two circles are diagonal. So again, just kind of US, Japan. We have computers, we have wheat. Notice I get a little less each time. Every time we produce one computer in the US, we give up 10 wheat. 1/10 of a computer. Every time we produce one computer in Japan, we give up 5 wheat, or 1/5 of a computer. And we now looking at this trade table now that, again, Japan, because it's the lowest number, is going to produce computers. The US is going to produce wheat. Okay. So yes, the two countries should trade. The reasoning is because each has a comparative advantage in the opposite good. Okay. Won't always be the case. So if you do get circles on top of one another, so for example, if I work this and I had a circle here as well, I always tell students double check your math. It can happen, but double check your math. Okay. Who should produce what? Okay. So who should produce which product? Well, we can look at the previous slide here, and that's what I'm just going to go back to. So who should produce what? Okay, well, each country should produce what they have a comparative advantage in. So here, Japan should produce computers and specialize in computers. The US should produce wheat and specialize in wheat. And again, we can just see that from the trade table by looking who should produce what. Japan follow it over computers. US follow it over should produce wheat. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. What is a fair price for one good in terms of another? And I think it's worth kind of resetting our graph to that extent. So again, we have the US and we have Japan. I should have put these a little bit different, but it's okay. Computers and wheat. And we get 10 wheat, 10th of a computer, and let's just do that there. Okay, 5 wheat, 5th of a computer, and then I'm going to go ahead and let's do it this way. Let's highlight it. So 5, that's Japan. It's going to produce computers. 10th, and that's the US, and they're going to produce wheat. Okay, so that's the information that we have so far. Now, when I look at what is a fair price for one good in terms of the other, remember you have to start with the outside here. So what I'm going to say is a fair price for computers. So maybe the question asks, every time Japan sends one computer to the US, how much wheat will it expect to get in return? Or how much wheat makes it a fair trade? Okay, that would be a really good example of a test type question that I would ask you. So let me grab my eraser because I made a mistake. Fair trade or fair price, you'll see it listed both ways. A fair, how much wheat makes it a fair trade? Okay, now remember, work the trade table from the outside in. So what this is asking about is it's asking about computers. So that tells me in the question which row to go to. Because it is asking about computers, I'm going to go to the computer row. Okay. Now, when I get to the computer row, I'm interested in these two numbers here. Okay. So a fair price for one computer would be between and including 5 tons of wheat to 10 tons of wheat, with the fairest of them all being 7 wheat, right smack dab in the middle. But sometimes we might send less because we're angry at a country, and sometimes we might send more because that country might be underdeveloped. So that's why we have a range here. So when you talk about trade and trade negotiations, these will often be a range in here. Okay? Okay. Okay. There. Okay, so let's try this a little bit differently now and ask ourselves, I'm going to change up the question. If the US sends 1 ton of wheat to Japan, what will make it a fair trade? Okay, so every time the US sends 1 ton of wheat to Japan, how much or how many, how much wheat will it take, or I'm sorry, that's wrong. How many computers will it take to make this a fair trade? The English is bothering me on that one. Okay. How? Okay, so every time the US sends 1 ton of wheat to Japan, how many computers will the US need to make it a fair trade? Okay, so take a second and think about how you might look at this. Okay, and so if you're thinking, okay, it's asking about wheat, so you're going to go to your wheat row, you're exactly right. So now the answer will be that every time the US so every time the US sends 1 ton of wheat to Japan, the US will expect to get between and including 1/10 and 1/5 of a computer. That's what makes it a fair trade. Between and including 1/10 and 1/5 computer. So the trade table also can tell us what is fair, okay? And remember, this is like a number line. So between those 2 points and including the endpoints as well. Okay, who should export and who should import which good? So let me go ahead and put this in again. This time I'll put Japan over here, why not? And the US over here. And I'll still put computers here. And wheat over here. So every time 1 computer, we give up 5 wheat, and 1 wheat, we give up 1/5 of a computer. The US, we give up 10 wheat and 1/10 of a computer. And again, even though I drew this differently this time, we should be able to look at these and still get the same comparative advantages. Notice it didn't matter which I put where, we still end up with the same comparative advantages. Okay, so who should export and who should import? The country, a country should export the good that they have a comparative advantage in. Okay, so if we look at this, we can say, all right, so that must mean, and let's see, that Japan should export computers. The US should export wheat. So Japan is going to send wheat. I'm sorry, Japan is going to send computers to the US, and the US is going to send wheat to Japan. Export meaning sell it. Okay, the second part of this question asks who's going to import what? So a country is going to import wherever there's no circle. Okay. So where there is no comparative advantage or no circle, right? So let's look at this and let's see where we have no circles. Well, we have no circle here and we have no circle here. So that must mean then, if we talk about this in export and import language, that the US will import, right? Kind of follow it down and over computers. And Japan will import wheat. Okay. All right. So that's the end of this learning objective. And again, the trade table, I think just as long as you set it up correctly, you're not going to get the wrong answer. It takes a while and it takes some practice so that this becomes intuitive. I have another practice problem coming up, I think in objective 4. So at this point, you should be able to set up the trade table. It shouldn't feel really familiar to you, but the more practice problems that you do, and again, all of the examples in your book will also help you understand how to set up that trade table to answer the 4 questions of should these 2 countries trade? If so, who should produce what? Who should export and import which goods? And what's a fair price for one good in terms of the other? I'll see you next time in Chapter 2, Objective 3. Thanks for your time.